Hello, this is Jeremy, and before we begin this episode, I wanted to provide something of a content warning. Although there will be some lighthearted elements to this episode, there will also be others that are not, and those include frank discussions of, and sometimes detailed descriptions of, torture, both mental and physical, of people in precarious situations, sometimes of children and even infants. So if that is something that is going to be difficult for you, I might recommend skipping this episode entirely or trying to anticipate when we are discussing experiments specifically under the umbrella of MK Ultra and its predecessors. Thank you for listening. Hope you get a lot out of this otherwise. In August of 1962, a group of MK Ultra affiliated researchers, led by the enigmatic Dr. Jolly West, decided to artificially induce specific behavioral patterns in a young male elephant in order to develop techniques of arresting or controlling that behavior. Young male elephants during mating season will often exhibit what is known as must, which involves aggressive, erratic, and often violently destructive actions. Dr. West believed that the best way to induce must would be to use LSD. 300,000 micrograms of LSD. They acquired their test subject, Tusko, from the Lincoln Park Zoo in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. They brought Tusko to their facility and fired a dart containing the liquid into Tusko's flank. Within 5 minutes, West recorded that Tusko, quote, trumpeted, collapsed, fell heavily on his right side, defecated, and went into status epilepticus, end quote. When it became clear that the elephant was not recovering on his own, West administered an antipsychotic, promazine, which stopped Tusko's seizures, but did not bring him to consciousness. West then ingested the elephant with pentobarbital, a barbiturate used to execute prisoners in the United States. He gave no medical or otherwise scientific explanation for the use of these two drugs, nor any methodology regarding why he began his research with 300,000 micrograms of LSD instead of steadily increasing the dose over time. An hour and 40 minutes after the test began, Tusko was dead.
Welcome to ProlesPod. Hello and welcome to ProlesPod, your bi-weekly dose of history without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers, the best way to do so. If you want to extra support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's lots of great stuff there, such as access to exclusive content, such as our Theory Beats project, monthly Q&As, surprise drop episodes, bonus episodes, early access, listening to live recording sessions, with more options on the way. So special shout out to our recent Patreon subscribers since our last episode. Thank you so much to Graham, Michael McNiven, Ryan Smith, and Graham. This episode is brought to you by the Dulles Brothers, who gifted us with these Flintstones branded vitamin supplements called Mind Melters. It looks like it's a multivitamin of some sort containing lysergic acid diethylamide. I don't really know what that is, but I guess we'll find out together after the show.
Fuck. No, they didn't tell us when they gave it to us. They just gave it to us, you know?
We're thinking about isolating, taking them just cause.
Sounds good. I can't wait to try it with you guys. So today we're going to be talking about MK Ultra, which means mind control, CIA, and other wonderful programs funded and directed by the U.S. government. Any thoughts from our team before I hand it over to our subject matter experts?
So excited for what I am sure is about to be a really positive and uplifting episode.
Yeah, comrades, I'm pretty sure that content warning at the beginning was just an exaggeration.
Our subject matter experts today are Justin and Jeremy. Where would you like to begin?
It's fucked up. It is deeply fucked up. As bad as you might think it is, it's probably worse.
Yeah, it is like a tiny step down from what the Nazis did.
Yeah, pretty much.
Justin, Jeremy, if you guys are ready, take it away.
Cool. So we're more or less going to move through this chronologically, although there will be a little bit of jumping around. We'll be looking at kind of what preceded MK Ultra, the other projects that got folded into it, some of the research that was done before it was MK Ultra, as well as some of the worst people the world has ever developed being brought in to work on these projects.
Also, we're going to talk a little bit about what MK Ultra kind of evolved into once they realized that destroying the lives of thousands of people wasn't actually going to produce mind control.
Yeah, crazy. And sort of one of the central figures who led the MK Ultra project is this individual named Sidney Gottlieb. He is the focus, I guess not the total focus, but he's a huge part of the main book that we read in preparation for this episode, which is Poisoner in Chief. And I wanted to kind of lay out some details about this man's life because it's wild how you might imagine this person to be and then how he was in reality. Just completely, they seem at odds with one another. If you're looking at fictional media of somebody who goes around poisoning and killing and ruining the lives of thousands of people around the world, you might imagine some like sinister dude, like he lives in a fucking cave or a penthouse apartment or like a brownstone in fucking Alexandria or something like that. So let me just get into it. So Sidney Gottlieb lived in an eco lodge with planet-friendly outdoor toilets. He had a garden. He kept goats that would, sort of trim his foliage for him. He wrote poetry. He was a proponent of the healing power of meditation. He retired from the CIA at only 54 years old, so he didn't stay there till he died. And when he left, he spent a few years traveling the world with his wife, specifically looking for needy folks that they might be able to help. And he was the primary developer of poison for the CIA. And he spent 2 decades trying to develop techniques of mind control.
Love a multifaceted king.
Yes, he's a
sociopath.
He's a sociopath. He's a psychopath. I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't want to diagnose this man, but he, the ability to live this quiet, very liberal life. That's like the eco-liberal dream. There, you travel the world helping people. You live in the woods in an ecologically friendly cabin, but then at the same time, you're on behalf of the United States torturing and poisoning people. And that's a wild dichotomy to exist in one person, I think.
Yeah, and he was not reluctant about the way that he did it either. It's not like he was like, oh man, this is a heavy burden. Like, he was enthusiastic.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, so although he was called to testify about his projects briefly in 1975, nothing came of it. He was never charged or convicted for any crimes, which we are going to discuss many of them. And there are many. He died peacefully in his home in 1999 at the age of 80.
Yeah, and it should also be mentioned. So when he testified, that was, I believe, the church commissioner right after around that time, right, when the U.S. was kind of atoning for its secret organizations, which of course just continued, but smarter. But before they did the inquiry, they destroyed thousands and thousands and thousands of files. And the thing that fucks me up is, after reading all these crazy fucking stories, do we not know about?
Right. Yeah. There's one in here where they destroyed all the documents related to the torture of this individual. They just have recordings of basically acquiring him and then releasing him. And then everything else in between is lost. But yeah, it gets wild.
And also, or rather, he said that he protested the destruction of the documents because it's illegal to get rid of any federal property. So very...
He specifically asked his assistant to destroy the
he's a liar.
The documents. He's full of shit.
So Gottlieb's parents, like a lot of Eastern European Jewish people, fled the rolling waves of pogroms, which took place through the early 20th century. His parents left Hungary. The book kind of like breezes over this, and I can't find any other details about it, but there's a mention that Gottlieb's parents paid for 3 different operations on Sydney to address his clubfoot, but they said they paid for it using their sweatshop. And I'm like, what do you mean? Do they own a sweatshop? Is that like what they're saying there? Like, did they work in a sweatshop? I don't really understand, but there's no further details. Anyway, he attended James Monroe High School in the Bronx. He went to City College, which is known as the Harvard of the proletariat. Probably not anymore. I think City College is kind of tough to get into now. But he studied German before transferring to the University of Wisconsin to study agricultural biology and major in chemistry. There, he joined the Young People's Socialist League. He attended grad school at the California Institute of Technology, where he obtained a doctorate in biochemistry in just 3 years. So he's a very smart man in spite of everything, I guess. He met the woman who would become his wife in California. She was kind of a hippie, liberal. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian missionary, but like rebelled against that kind of culture, I suppose. She was studying to be a preschool educator at the time. Her name is Margaret Moore, and she was kind of a strange match for Sidney because, he was from this Eastern European Jewish background, and she was kind of like cornbread American, but also grew up part of her life in India. So she had this kind of esoteric view of religion, and then was trying to do like early childhood education, but he was looking into like chemistry and biochemistry and stuff like that. So weird match, but I guess they worked. They got married while they were still in grad school, which was kind of a weird thing to do, even at the time. Her parents were like all for it because they were like, she's a wild child and she needs to settle down and all this stuff. So Sidney attempted to enlist in the army in 1943, but was rejected as a result of his disability, which was crushing to him. And he looked for other ways that he could help the war effort. He started at the Department of Agriculture before moving to the Food and Drug Administration, but he got kind of bored and he wanted more of a challenge. As such, in 1948, he got a job with the National Research Council, where he studied plant diseases, fungicides, and notably for what comes later, ergot alkaloids, which are both vasoconstrictors and hallucinogens. Almost immediately, though, he moved to another position as a research chemist at the University of Maryland studying fungal metabolism. This is the point at which he and his wife move into their eco-friendly cabin in the woods or whatever. They had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. This is the thing that kind of like weirds me out, is like he's kind of living a great life. Like he has a firmly, what would have been upper middle class job in the like late 1940s. He's got 4 kids. He's got a wife. He's got a garden. He's got goats. He's got a decent job. It pays enough money for him to afford 15 acres in Vienna, Virginia. So he's living comfortably. That was not enough for him. Like he needed more. So I guess kind of in the meantime, as World War II is winding down, Truman decides that there's not really any peacetime need for an international spy agency. So he abolishes the Office of Strategic Services. But then, 2 years later, he changes his mind and he signs the National Security Act, which was penned specifically by Allen Dulles himself. And that established the fucking CIA. So he was like, oh, we don't need the OSS, but we do need the CIA. Also, in the meantime, the State Department was busy funneling Nazis into the U.S. via Operation Paperclip, including Dr. Kurt Blome, or at least they attempted to, who oversaw some profoundly horrific human experimentation, both in Poland and in Germany, in the realm of chemical and biological weapons testing. Also in the meantime, the State Department agents tracked down Dr. Shiro Ishii, the director of some people are going to recognize this name, the Unit 731. They granted him his superiors and his subordinates immunity from prosecution in exchange for the data that they acquired while working at Unit 731. And then put them to work in a bunch of black sites around East Asia, where they continued basically doing exactly what they had been doing at Unit 731, but for the State Department. So at Unit 731, they captured mostly Chinese civilians, but also Korean and Mongolian nationals, anti-Japanese partisans, criminals, mental health patients, and then subjected them to a variety of torturous deaths. Almost everything that they did at Unit 731 eventually resulted in the death of somebody. There are some estimates that are as low as 3,000 people dying there, some as high as 12,000, and they were all fucking terrible. They were exposed to poisonous gases so that their lungs could be removed. Often their lungs were removed while they were still alive, because Ishii felt that there would be more data that could be extracted if they were able to record the patient's responses to these things all the way to the moment of death. So they would take their organs out while they were still alive. They would cook them slowly with electricity to determine how much voltage and for how long would be needed to produce death. They would hang people upside down to study how the body chokes itself naturally over time. They would lock people in hyperbaric chambers and turn up the pressure until their eyes popped out. They would spin people in centrifuges until the gravity killed them. They would infect them with various diseases and toxins such as anthrax, syphilis, and the plague, as well as cholera. They would forcibly impregnate people so as to produce infants, so they could vivisect the infants, as in cut them open while they were still alive. They would tie people to stakes and shoot them with flamethrowers, or tie them to stakes outside in the cold to observe the effects of hypothermia. They would tie them to stakes outside and then explode anthrax bombs a few feet away from them to test both the impact of shrapnel and the anthrax infection. These people would live for no more than a week, but they would leave them for a week tied to these stakes just to see what would happen. They would inject people with air to produce embolisms, inject them with animal blood just to see what the fuck happened. They would amputate limbs and then watch as people died of blood loss or gangrene. Unit 731 used this data to produce a bunch of different things that they would use essentially on either civilian populations or in military encounters. So they would produce poison candy, hairpins, fountain pens. They specifically infected fleas with plague and anthrax toxins, and then drop them on civilian Chinese populations sort of en masse to study the spread of disease, but also to, wipe them out essentially, because their plan was essentially the same as the Nazis in terms of like Lebensraum, right? They were trying to clear China of Chinese people so that the Japanese could move in and establish colonies there.
And so at this point in time, obviously there is no justification for this kind of behavior. And to the extent that the public was aware, there wasn't really need for a justification. But even internally, like, what is the justification for this? Like, what is the argument for all of these different individual things?
They had a similar sort of ideology to the Nazis that the Japanese were a superior race of people and that the Chinese were inferior. And so they were testing these things on Chinese people or Mongolians or Koreans or whatever in order to learn more, much the way that we do with animals. You know what I mean? They were testing on lesser humans because that would create better outcomes for Japanese people, they thought. If they could see, okay, well, this is what gangrene does to a human body. Now we know, how much gangrene it takes and how long it takes to kill somebody. We can more effectively treat our soldiers who get gangrene naturally or something like that, Or it might just be, we have a weapon here, this flamethrower, we can kill them with this much, gas versus this much. If we surround a village and burn it to the ground, it'll take people this long to die.
But on that same framework, the same sort of bedrock of systemic dehumanization of a specific group of people. Yeah, because it's useful to them, obviously. And of course, this is all happening
before, well, I guess depending on when you start World War II, it's a very ambiguous thing. But these events would have happened before and during World War II. But the United States became aware of this, and rather than prosecuting these people as war criminals and for committing crimes against humanity, they went, hey, we can use these people, right? And so they took all of the data that Unit 731 gathered and took it back to Washington. And then they employed these people to continue doing what they were doing, more clandestinely, obviously, and under the sort of straight governance of the U.S. State Department. But yeah, fantastic stuff.
So while the U.S. was granting the members of Unit 731 immunity, bringing them back to the U.S., utilizing their research, the Soviet Union, on the other hand, actually held a series of trials for these war criminals and convicted many of them. And they served.
I think you mean show trials?
Show trials. Well, exactly. Well, when they occurred,
the Soviet Union didn't actually have trials; they only had show trials.
Exactly. In 1949, when the trials actually took place, the U.S. was calling them communist propaganda show trials, trying to pretend that Unit 731 didn't actually either exist or do the things that the Soviets were saying they did. But
Shiro Ishii was specifically he hid from the Soviet Union because he knew that if he was captured by them, that they would prosecute him. And the United States went to him and was like, look, we can protect you from the Soviet Union if you turn over these documents to us. And he was like, well, that's not good enough. I want protection for my superiors and my subordinates as well. And they were like, done deal, that's a fair trade. So yeah, they snuck all of these people out of Japan and put them in places like Korea, like South Korea, the Philippines, and places like that. And in some cases, they kept them in Japan if they felt like it was something that they could hide from other governments. Anyway, here's the inception of this goofy idea that the Soviet Union had already developed and perfected mind control. It is a ludicrous story, but this is where the idea for the projects which preceded MKUltra came from. In Soviet-controlled Hungary, Roman Catholic prelate Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty was charged with and confessed to attempting to reestablish the Austro-Hungarian Empire by trying to steal the royal crown. Pope Pius XII was like, that's fucked up. This is a serious outrage. It inflicts a deep wound. And he excommunicated all of the Catholics who were involved in the attempted coup. However, the CIA was like, this is a show trial. Why would he confess to these things if he didn't do it? And they were like, his delivery was fake and wooden, and the Soviets must have done something to him to make him say these things. And so they were convinced that the Soviet Union had already developed mind control. And they were like, we have to catch up to this technology, which again, there was no evidence for. This was all vibes based. They were just like, the vibes this dude has given off tells me he's been mind controlled, Yeah.
The vibes-based international order. Exactly.
And the things that followed are so fucking terrible. And they just psyched themselves up to do this. They were like, they got mind control. They have it. I know they've got it. I can tell because he's got a wooden delivery. And then they fucking torture people for decades. It's one of the wildest things I've ever seen. Also simultaneously, the U.S. Chemical and Biological Warfare Center at Camp Dietrich had basically fallen out of favor because the nuclear bomb was developed, and that's kind of where the federal government, the military, was putting all of its money, because they were like, oh, well, we can wipe out civilian populations and still leave the buildings intact that way. We don't need to develop germs or chemicals to kill them, which of course the United States denied for its entire existence that they would ever use biological or chemical weapons, but they developed them nonetheless. Once this quote-unquote show trial happens for Mindszenty, it just gave them so much life. They were just like, oh, thank you, God, for this precious gift that you have given me.
It's so fun.
Yeah, they basically were reinvigorated and brought back to life because the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA were all like, oh shit, we better come up with technologies like the Soviets have. I bet they're using drugs on this dude. But there is a lot going on at this time. So like a lot of this is simultaneous or within like a few years. It's all essentially between the end of World War II and 1950 that all of these things that I'm explaining right now are happening. In 1946, a former Nazi POW camp, as in they kept POWs mostly from the United States in this camp in Germany. It was taken over by the U.S. military and converted into a U.S. Army POW camp. It was renamed Camp King, and a group of interrogators who are known as the quote-unquote rough boys set about ritually abusing Nazis, which I'm definitely not opposed to. However, of course, Alan Dulles got wind of the rough boys and decided that they could be useful in torturing other people, not just Nazis. In 1943, so I guess this is during World War II, Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, was accidentally exposed to ergot toxins during an experiment. He suddenly got dizzy and decided to go home. He found bicycling very difficult, and when he arrived at his house, he went to bed, had a series of vivid hallucinations and kind of recorded how he felt about it and what it was like. When he went back to work, he started looking at ways to extract what he figured was the actual hallucinogenic element within ergot, and ended up developing a series of lysergic acid diethylamides. He felt satisfied with the 25th iteration, and so he began experimenting on himself and colleagues who volunteered for the study. LSD-25 was, in his mind, an excellent jumping off point for studying the biochemical processes and bases for mental illness. So that was kind of his intent for this research. Of course, then the United States gets a hold of it.
I held my breath when you said experimented on colleagues voluntarily. I'm like, oh.
Yeah. There is like a doctor who's sort of peripherally associated with MK Ultra who would he got acid from Gottlieb in order to do some tests on, he called them volunteers, but it's extremely questionable as to whether they were. But then he just took the fucking acid home to his house in, I think, Long Island, I forget. And then just he would take it himself. He would dose his friends without telling them. He would have these wild parties where he would give people punch with LSD in it. I mean, so
Gottlieb himself did that with CIA parties.
He did, yeah.
That's what started the whole Frank Olson thing.
Yeah. So L. Wilson Green of the U.S. Army's Chemical Corps had sort of different ideas about how LSD could be used, not to understand or treat mental illness, but he figured that if you could aerosolize and weaponize LSD, you could drop it on an enemy population and have a totally different type of warfare. He points at how violent and destructive warfare was, but he's if you could just get everybody to freak out and lose control of themselves, then you could take over a country without killing, half as many or a quarter as many people or have as much destruction. So that was kind of the direction he took. And
they called it Woodstock AIDS.
So you're saying that they were humanitarians?
Exactly. Yeah. L. Wilson Green was a humanitarian. He's a pacifist warmonger. Is a more wholesome form of subjugation.
It's vibes-based war.
Yeah, vibes-based war for vibes-based men. So Green puts all this down in a report, and several high-ranking Army officials were like, "Totally, this is a great idea." But the director of the CIA at the time, he was the first director of the CIA, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, was like, "You know what? Let's join forces, boys." So he sends a handful of CIA agents over to Camp Dietrich. And this was basically, for the most part, although there's a story I'm about to tell that kind of contradicts this, the Army was empowered to develop these weapons and develop these drugs and poisons and whatever, but they were technically not authorized to use them. The CIA, on the other hand, did not have to follow any of the rules that the U.S. Army did.
Yeah, there were actually only 2 or 3 instances in the entire history of MK Ultra and its different variations that they got authorization for anything.
Right. Yeah. For the most part, they just did whatever the fuck they wanted to. So this joint project between the Army and the CIA was referred to as MK Naomi, which is named after one of the founders' secretary, which is a weird fucking thing to do. It's a really fucking weird thing to do. So if the CIA needed to assassinate someone, the Camp Dietrich boys would make a toxin for them. If the CIA wanted to know how biological weapons would function within buildings or on a citywide scale, the Camp Dietrich boys would whip up a quote-unquote benign germ that would mimic the qualities of the real thing. And then the CIA would, in one instance, they took this stuff to the Pentagon. They pretended to be HVAC workers, and they put it into the ducts of the Pentagon. And they determined that, I think it was something like a third of Pentagon staff would have died if it had been a real biological attack.
Yeah, these guys are wild.
Weird ass dudes. So then following the test at the Pentagon, the Army was like, hey, I've got a great idea. They went to San Francisco Bay in a minesweeper, and they released clouds of this artificial biological weapon essentially into San Francisco Bay, into the air through the fog that was drifting in from San Francisco Bay. They basically coated all of San Francisco with this stuff. They covered areas of Berkeley, areas of Oakland, several other suburbs. The bacterium they used was specifically chosen because it had a slightly red tint, and it was therefore easier to track. But 11 people in San Francisco checked themselves into a hospital for severe urinary tract infections, and all of them had a red tint in their urine. One of those 11 people was recovering from prostate surgery at the time, and he died as a result of this infection. All the doctors were just like, we don't know what this is. It's like a weird anomaly. But the Army did not let anyone know they were doing this. They just did it. And
all just to see how to do it, basically.
Yeah, basically, can we destroy an entire city of people, kill an entire city of people, or at least
without them knowing it.
Without them knowing that it happened. Exactly.
And now, a word from our sponsor. There comes a time in every concerned parent's life where you think, these kids are just growing too fast. We at ProlesPod know that feeling all too well, which is why we are so excited to partner with today's sponsor, the Dulles Brothers, to share their latest product, Mind Melters. A line of vitamins that will not only melt your child's mind, but stunt their growth and ensure they are your little babies forever. Each dose contains none of the essential vitamins and nutrients your child needs, but it does contain LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines, heroin, morphine, temazepam, mescaline, psilocybin, and alcohol. With your monthly subscription of Mind Melters, you'll also receive access to a convenient app feeding all your data directly to the CIA. Side effects may include fatigue, diarrhea, dry eye, nausea, PTSD, and death. Please literally do not take this shit, it will fucking kill you. Mind Melters come in several flavors, including Berry Blast, Lemon Lime, the Blue Scooby-Doo Snack, and Doritos. Get some for the whole family today. And now, back to the show.
So next up on our little carousel of horror, old Admiral Roscoe decided to move on to mind control. And the first name of this project was Bluebird, because they wanted to have prisoners sing like a bird, quote unquote, after they ingested whatever this drug was that they were going to develop. Early memos on Bluebird read that experimentation should be, quote, broad and comprehensive, involving both domestic and overseas activity, end quote, and that the ideal candidates for tests should be, quote, defectors, refugees, POWs, and other prisoners.
I like how refugees are in there, just like...
Oh, and it happens.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah. With the ultimate goal of, quote, investigating the possibility of control of an individual by application of special interrogation techniques, end quote. And by special interrogation techniques, they mean torture. They wanted to be able to give somebody a drug, torture them, and then get them to do whatever they wanted them to do. In 1950, General Walter Bedell Smith took over as director of the CIA, and in January 1951 decided to hire Alan Dulles, the former spy master of the OSS, who had become obsessed with applying the psychological research of Carl Jung to the process of interrogation. A memo from this period reads, Bluebird teams are to include persons qualified in medicine, psychological interrogation, the use of electroencephalograph, electric shock, and the polygraph, end quote.
Who was Jung?
After Freud, Jung was like the next big kind of, and honestly, I'm not going to try to speak intelligently on this topic because I don't know enough about Jung's philosophy to...
So what I know about Carl Jung is that he's Jordan Peterson's like favorite philosopher. So I think that's perhaps all that needs
All you need to know.
Although a lot of like modern Jungian people will argue that Jordan Peterson's application of Jung and even like general read or understanding of Jung is like not particularly accurate. But I do think that you're speaking to something there, like there's a there that Jung kind of deliberately creates these archetypes that are sort of like the astrology of psychology, right? Like you can read into them what you want to see, and you can project onto them what you want.
I'm shocked that Jordan Peterson misinterprets anything. That's crazy to me.
He needs to clean his room.
A second memo from this time encourages researchers to find ways to make a person, quote, commit acts useful to us under post-hypnotic suggestion, end quote. A third memo inquires, quote, can a person under hypnosis be forced to commit murder, end quote. So this is sort of where they were going. They wanted to be able to capture somebody, interrogate them, give them drugs, basically create the Manchurian Candidate, which is a funny, because the movie obviously implies that the Chinese have figured it out and that they're going to put this guy in charge and he's going to destroy the United States. But in reality, that's what the CIA was trying to do from the beginning, or pretty much from the beginning. So then we return to our rough boys at Camp King, because it was an already established detention and interrogation center. The CIA decided it would be kind of the ideal place to actualize all their hopes and dreams, like manifest that mind control they were hoping for Project Bluebird. But they didn't want to rely on the rough boys because they were like thugs basically. They were not intelligent. They were not educated. They didn't understand the finer techniques of fucking people up. They were just they like to beat people with baseball bats and stuff like that.
If you want to know like how the Cold War seeped so quickly into the American population, almost every person that wasn't like some fucking doctor that was approached by the CIA was like, fuck no, I'm not doing that. And then they were like, this is gonna be great for America, like blah blah blah, and then they were like, oh okay, oh yeah
right, yeah. So the CIA sent Bluebird operatives to Camp King to refine the tactics of the rough boys, but Camp King was not like a secure location. There were lots of army personnel there who were not in the inner circle. You know what I mean? So the CIA started looking for another location close to Camp King so that they could basically take prisoners from Camp King, move them to this other location, and torture them in a more secret locale. So they purchased this early 20th century villa in the village of Kronberg. It was at the end of a secluded country lane. It remained more or less the same building on the upper two floors. It had like a dozen bedrooms. It had a grand fireplace. It had, leaded windows. Yeah, it was owned by a wealthy Jewish family in the early 20th century before the Nazis came to power, at which point that family fled. As it was abandoned by the Nazis, the U.S. government bought it and turned it into a CIA black site.
It's like the first CIA black site, right?
It was basically the first CIA black site, yeah. Unless you count Camp King, I guess there's like...
That's not a black site.
Yeah. It's not really in the sense that this was. So the basement was full of these brick storerooms, which they converted into prison cells for torture. So as the Nazis were executed, imprisoned, or freed, obviously the CIA, so at Camp King, the first prisoners that were there were Nazis, and they would have been the first people tortured and interrogated by the CIA there. But they were eventually let go or executed or put into a regular prison. So they started bringing in captured Soviet and East German spies, but they also brought in refugees, as they mentioned in that earlier memo. They were like, if they brought a refugee in and the refugee didn't seem like they were, quote unquote, reliable, in other words, if they were not sort of vehemently opposed to whatever country they came from, say they were fleeing East Germany and they came over to West Germany and they got brought in by the CIA, they would interrogate them. And if they felt like this person's not a true believer in capitalism or whatever, they'd be like, oh, well, they're not reliable. They're probably a spy. They would bring them to Camp King and then take them to this black site at the villa. But one word that they repeatedly use to refer to these people is expendables, meaning that they could basically be tortured to death. They could be killed in these interrogations and no one would likely come looking for them. So if they were refugees or criminals or spies or defectors or something that seemed like they might be spies, these were the ideal candidates because they were unlikely to have anybody come try to find them if they went missing. So the chief medical advisor at the villa was known as Doc Fisher. He had been recruited from Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C., except, of course, Doc Fisher was actually, drumroll please, General Walter Schreiber, the former Surgeon General of the Wehrmacht under Adolf Hitler.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So he was initially captured by the Soviets, imprisoned in Lubyanka, which is a prison in Moscow. But he convinced the authorities in Moscow to let him go to East Berlin and teach at a university there, which, I thought the Soviets were oppressive and they, executed all their prisoners or kept them in gulags for the rest of their life. But apparently they let these guys go teach at universities. So while he was in East Berlin, and this ties into our GDR episode, but he basically left one day and walked across the border because there was no wall there to stop him. He walked across the border into West Berlin and turned himself over to the U.S. authorities.
But I guess they thought he was genuine.
They thought he was genuine. Yeah, they didn't take him to Camp King. And the U.S. was like, hey, we got a job for you. So Schreiber had approved a number of horrific human experiments at Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Dachau, including freezing subjects to death, injecting them with mescaline and other drugs meant to decrease mental inhibition. They also did similar experiments to the Japanese at Unit 731, where they would cut into tissue to allow gangrene to develop and then watch what happened. At Camp King, he was welcomed as an admired colleague, quote unquote, by the U.S. officials there. One night, Harvard professor and CIA operative Henry Beecher and General Schreiber spent the night discussing the application of psychoactive substances in interrogation for hours on the ground floor of the CIA villa, while expendables rotted in cells below. Beecher gushed about Schreiber's intelligence, absolutely loving their exchange of ideas. Harvard professor. It's good. There were other black sites in West Germany, and after the great success there, the U.S. opened several more in Japan, where they tortured and interrogated captured North Koreans, testing the effects of sodium amytal, a hypnotic and depressant, combined with a series of stimulants, benzodrine, choramine, and picrotoxin. The last of which, in addition to being a stimulant, also causes convulsions, seizures, and in a high enough dose, respiratory paralysis. They would dose them with the depressant and the stimulants in cycles just constantly. They would give them one, put them to sleep, then give them the other, jolt them awake so that they were disoriented, and then they could be, quote, coerced into reliving experiences from their past, end quote. So now our Operation Paperclip beneficiary, Kurt Blom, he comes back into the picture. His experiments in Poland and Germany, they both involved the use of hallucinogens in interrogation. He had initially turned down the U.S. offer. He was offered a U.S. paperclip contract, and he was like, I think I'm just going to go run a private medical practice, even though I've committed war crimes. I'm going to go head to my hometown of Dortmund and do some medicine. But when he heard that his good homie, General Schreiber, was himself about to become Doc Fisher, he decided it would be a good time to get back into researching how to ruin people's lives. Unfortunately for both of them, Schreiber got exposed as a Nazi war criminal and fled to Argentina. Because of all the negative attention, Colonel Garrison Cloverdale, the head of U.S. Army intelligence in Berlin, decided to revoke Blom's paperclip contract rather than risk sending another Nazi war criminal to the U.S. The CIA was fucking furious. They tried to overturn this decision. They tried to appeal to the executive branch to be like, you need to get the army under control. We need this guy, and you're keeping him away from us. You're keeping this Nazi war criminal away from us. But unfortunately, because of all the bad press around General Schreiber, the State Department was like, we're not going to fucking touch this guy. So luckily, though, Doc Fisher had just left his post at Camp King. So this perfect job for Blom opened up.
I can just imagine, like a whiny CIA guy being like, you're sending all our best people to Argentina.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if you've heard our Argentina episode, but like Argentina is the premier Nazi go-to.
Premier Nazi destination.
That in Canada, yeah.
That in Canada. All right. So now we come to the Nuremberg Code, which it was specifically designed and developed to address human experimentation conducted by the Nazis, and the Nuremberg Code was used to convict and execute Nazis for violations of this code, which I'm going to read to you now, because MK Ultra and all of these other projects violate essentially all of them. At one point or another, some of them violate all of them. Number 1, voluntary consent is essential. Number 2, the results of any experiment must be for the greater good of society. 3, human experiments should be based on previous animal experimentation. 4, experiments should be conducted by avoiding physical/mental suffering and injury. 5, no experiments should be conducted if it is believed to cause death/disability. 6, the risks should never exceed the benefits. 7, adequate facilities should be used to protect subjects. 8, experiments should be conducted only by qualified scientists. 9, subjects should be able to end their participation at any time. 10, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment when injury, disability, or death is likely to occur. And I am aware that the United States never adopted the Nuremberg Code as law, just like they never signed the Geneva Convention, but that does not make it morally okay to just violate these, what appear to me to be extremely basic human rights here.
I mean, it's like they were trying for it.
Oh, I know.
They were like, let's write all this out so we can see where we're going, right? We need goals.
Exactly. So Alan Dulles recruited a group of 3 men to be put in charge of Bluebird, all of whom were like fucking ghouls in their own right. But none of them had any kind of serious scientific background to operate the kind of minutia of Bluebird. So they started recruiting the best and brightest from around the U.S., which is when our primary villain of the story returns, our boy Sidney Gottlieb. He reported for duty on Friday, the 13th of July, 1951 to Camp Dietrich. He was hired to, quote unquote, organize a group of chemists to achieve the aims of Bluebird. After a few months of proving himself, Dulles promoted Gottlieb to head of the chemical division at Camp Dietrich. He also expanded Bluebird substantially and renamed it Artichoke. And there's some like weird mythology around what the name comes from, but there's actually no like direct evidence of why it's called Artichoke.
Sorry, I thought you were going to say that his secretary was named Artichoke.
No, one of the theories is that he's named after some violent gangster, Artichoke something or another. I forget the name of the dude, but yeah, that's one of the theories. But there's again no direct evidence of it. So the CIA also began operating a black site in the Panama Canal region, where they first began testing on a subject they codenamed Kelly, who was in fact a Bulgarian politician named Dmitry Dimitrov, who had been feeding info to the CIA, but whom the CIA suspected might have decided to switch loyalties. But when I say switch loyalties, I don't mean to like the KGB. I mean that he was possibly going to start selling secrets to French intelligence instead of the CIA. And like the CIA can't even have people talking to their allies. Like that's not good. It's not acceptable for them. Yeah. So they hired people to kidnap, quote unquote, Kelly, bring him out of the country, take him to Greece, and put him in a Greek prison for 6 months, where he was tortured by Greek special agents who, after 6 months, were like, this guy doesn't know anything. He probably wasn't going to actually sell any secrets to the French. This was all a big waste of time. And the CIA was like, I don't know, man. I think maybe we can get more out of him. And because Dimitrov had, like, previously he was pro-US, obviously enough to be selling secrets to the CIA, but his experience in this Greek prison for 6 months fucked him up so bad that he was anti-US. And the CIA was like, this guy is the perfect test subject for Bluebird or Artichoke, because he is opposed to us now, but we think if we can give him the right drugs and torture him in the right way, we can convert him back to being on our side, and then we can use him as an agent. And they took him to this facility in Panama, where this is the story I was talking about earlier. They destroyed all documentation as to what was done to him, but they kept him for 3 years. 3 years in this fucking black site in Panama, in the Panama Canal region. And then they just let him go. And years later, he was in the United States and he tried to sell his story to Parade magazine, but the CIA intervened and told Parade that this guy was like a crackpot. He was unreliable, and he just made up stories about the CIA all the time because he was paranoid.
But for all the ladies listening, take this as a lesson. You cannot change him.
You cannot change him, no matter how many drugs you give him. So there's a whole section in this book on a particular sub-project of Operation Mockingbird, which was a CIA media disinformation campaign designed to primarily turn people away from communism and spread misinformation and whatever. But there was one particular sub-project in which the CIA scared Americans into thinking that the Chinese had already developed mind control technology, and they were using it to turn average non-communist Chinese citizens into communists. Edward Hunter was a wartime propagandist and was already like a rabid anti-communist before he joined the CIA. But he wrote an article published in the Miami News in which he claimed to have gone to China and uncovered a secret project based at the North Chinese People's Revolutionary University. The name that he gave to the process that the Chinese used was xi nao, literally meaning wash brain, which is where the term brainwashing comes from. And it is fake. It was invented by the CIA. It has no basis in reality. Either nothing is brainwashing or everything is, you know what I mean? Like, if you separate somebody from their existing community and give them a new set of values, that's just enculturation. That happens all the time. If you move from one city to another, or one country to another, you will incorporate aspects of that new place in your personality. That's not brainwashing. It's just a thing that happens to human beings. You know what I mean?
From what I understand, that term in Chinese also, where it is used in modern times, at least, is in regards to a political context of like political consciousness, becoming aware, maybe even comparing it to this concept of the new Soviet man or woman, where, through engaging with socialism and, building a new world, people change in the process of doing that. So that's where I understand the term to come from.
And the thing about Mandarin and Cantonese is that there are multiple words that mean the same thing, and there are characters in combination that can mean different things based on their context. And there are words that have connotations that differ based on the symbols you use. And quite often when the Western press, or when the CIA or Radio Free Asia or whatever get a hold of documents or recordings from China, they will intentionally take the least charitable interpretation of any phrase used. If they can make a word that means one thing probably and make it mean something else almost certainly not, then they will do that. So, again, wash brain may be one of the interpretations, but not the sole interpretation. You know what I mean? What's really wild, though, is that later, like after this story, which was again developed by the CIA under Project Mockingbird, years down the road, the CIA then begins to believe its own bullshit like they then believe that the Chinese have actually developed brainwashing, and they're like, well, we gotta get out there and get our own technology going here to combat this thing that we made up ourselves. It's mind-boggling stuff. They had to win the brainwashing race. So the first drug that they attempted to use as a truth serum was THC, which I find incredible. Scientists at Dietrich refined and distilled and then dosed THC into candy, salad dressing, and mashed potatoes. The scientists then tried it on themselves. So they basically made weed extract and then fucking like gave it to themselves just to see what would happen. But they decided it was not like a suitable truth serum.
To discover the underlying truth of the universe, which is that mashed potatoes are delicious.
Yes, exactly.
They played Xbox for 4 hours and then went to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Then they tried cocaine. It was injected into mental patients, which increased talkativeness, but it had a short usefulness period and was unreliable for interrogations, according to them. Then they moved on to heroin. The CIA noted that the drug was the drug of choice for police officers and intelligence operatives, which is incredible, kind of given the direction that heroin takes in terms of propaganda in the future. But it was apparently the drug of choice for cops.
To use themselves or to
Yes.
use on
Yeah.
other people. Okay.
No.
Okay. So
Yeah.
before it
No.
was the donut.
Yeah, they
It was
would
the
they would
opiate.
do the heroin exactly. Yeah,
Sure.
the
Sure.
opiate of the pigs.
Opiates are the opiates of
Yes,
the pigs.
opiates are the opiates of the pigs. So the CIA intended to use heroin not in the context of like mind control, but they figured out that if they got somebody addicted to heroin and then took it away from them, they could be convinced to do things that they would not otherwise do or say things that they would not otherwise say. And this happens again later in another story that I'm going to tell, and it's fucking terrible. But it was not particularly useful in the context of mind control, so they abandoned this project as well. Mescaline was the next to be tried. It's being mild compared to LSD. Sidney Gottlieb wondered why that was not the direction to take. But before he used it on others, he wanted to understand the effects himself. Of his first trip, Gottlieb said, quote, I happen to experience an out-of-bodiness, a feeling as though I am in a kind of transparent sausage skin that covers my whole body and it is shimmering. And I have a sense of
Been there.
sense of well-being and euphoria for most of the next hour to 2 hours, and then it gradually subsides. End quote.
Honestly, the shimmering sausage skin, it can make a man crazy.
So Gottlieb's early tests were on volunteers, mostly CIA agents or other scientists at Camp Dietrich. In one such test, an army officer swore to never reveal a secret, revealed it under LSD, and then forgot that he revealed it. I honestly think this story is bullshit. I think this army officer knew what Gottlieb wanted out of LSD and did what he thought Gottlieb would want him to do, which is to swear he wouldn't say something, and then claim he forgot it, because that would be like, oh shit, this is exactly the drug we're looking for. Let's pursue this. And that's exactly what the CIA did after that. Hearing that story, that must have seemed like this is the fucking thing. This is the one we need to use because it worked so well on this one dude.
Signs.
Exactly. Vibes. I need to be clear at this point that there was no evidence whatsoever that either the Soviets or the Chinese were even pursuing this type of technology, let alone that they had accomplished it. None. There were the vibes from that one video that they watched, and they were like, wooden performance must be mind control. It's like a fucking like boomer who like half watches a video on Facebook with no context from where it comes from or who did it or why they did it or what is actually being said, and they half remember it, and then they internalize it, and then they make it part of their fucking political life, and they vote on it and they act on it. That's like what these people are doing. Like there is no evidence that the Chinese or the Soviets were doing this, but they were convinced that they were, and they had to beat them at this brainwashing race that was not happening.
Also, by the way, while they were all testing the drugs on themselves and never stopping to be like, do you think that this is changing how we're interpreting the world around us? I don't know. I think I have an accurate perception of reality.
Sure. Why not? Yeah, sure. Why not? But what like really accelerated Gottlieb's research was the election of Dwight Eisenhower, because Eisenhower appointed Allen Dulles as director of the CIA, and he appointed Allen's brother, John Foster Dulles, as the Secretary of State. So this basically meant that the CIA had coverage pretty much from the top of the executive branch all the way down to the bottom to do whatever the fuck they wanted, carte blanche, and they would never have to answer to anyone. If anybody got pissed off, then they could go to John Foster Dulles and he would make it disappear, you know? Like they already operated pretty much with impunity up to this point, but now it was like fucking no holds barred. They could do anything they wanted.
Yeah. So I want to go back here for a second. So we're talking about, you're mentioning how there's no evidence that the Soviets or the Chinese were developing their own mind control program. And if anyone in the CIA was sincerely, maybe confused about this, they could have been, mistaking the building of class consciousness in the Soviet Union, in China, in all these places as being a form of mind control, when really it's just people gaining awareness of the impacts capitalism has on them and their society. And it's kind of
just what people wanted,
which we still see now.
Cough, TikTok, cough.
Yeah,
exactly. And like I see it as a part of a long trend of any kind of anti-capitalist perspectives being viewed as a mental aberration in capitalism.
Yeah, and that again will come up when we talk about the North Korean defectors. So Gottlieb starts reaching out to psychiatrists around the U.S. for assistance in testing psychoactive substances. One such doctor, Paul Hock, was happy to comply. He began injecting 42-year-old professional tennis player Harold Blauer with increasingly heavy doses of mescaline, with neither Blauer's approval nor with any kind of warning to Blauer. So this tennis player, he came to Dr. Hock with, he had depression and he wanted some kind of treatment for it. But Hock was like, I'm just going to fucking fuck with this dude, I guess. So the tests began on December the 5th of 1952, and they ended on January the 8th of 1953, when Blauer was given an injection of 14 times his initial dose. Blauer protested, but Hock continued anyway. At 9:53, the dose was administered. At 10:01 a.m., his body became stiff, and at 12:15, he was pronounced dead. So this is like the first human casualty of these projects that we are definitely aware of. I am certain that at these black sites around the world, in Japan, in Germany, in South Korea, in the Philippines, and Panama Canal region, I am sure people died there. But this is the first one that we are certain died as a result of these tests. But round after round of tests didn't really accomplish anything. They got no closer to mind control after all of these 18 months of research.
And then they gave up.
Nope.
They were like, let's pack it up, boys. It's time to go home.
Nope.
We tried.
Nope. Yeah, no, like the little engine that could. Gottlieb just wouldn't give up. He just had to keep going.
Nevertheless, they persisted.
Yeah.
In an alternate universe, they would have given up. But on the other hand, they would have had like a mountain of edibles to consume. So we could be living in socialism right now.
We could be, but instead we go to LSD. So he decided that using drugs on such a limited quantity of expendables, mostly overseas, just didn't really provide the hands-on experience that he needed to achieve mind control. He needed access to lots of subjects, and he needed to move the research more to the United States. In order to do that, he needed to create a new project, an umbrella project under which all of this different research could be conducted. So on April the 13th of 1953, Allen Dulles formally approved Gottlieb's request to helm and develop such a project. And this was, of course, MKUltra.
Which was named after Mary Kate Ultra.
Yes, exactly. She was the secretary. Lord. So the first tests under MKUltra were conducted in Greenwich Village. Gottlieb hired this dirty undercover narcotics detective, George Hunter White, to talk unsuspecting people into coming to White's apartment for drinks and conversation, only for them to...
I'm not sure who would be suspecting, to be clear.
Yeah. He would then dose them with LSD, and then there would be a group of CIA agents in the next door apartment who would be monitoring, using listening devices and like one-way mirror.
So George Hunter White actually got his own sub-project later on, Sub-Project 42. And this is actually one of the more like flamboyant of the MK Ultra projects. The goal was to feed drugs to unsuspecting civilians, but this time with sex. So he got a group of prostitutes that he had developed relationships with over the year because he was a narcotic officer. And he would lure them to this pad in San Francisco where he would dose them and then watch. They were trying to figure out if people would like spill secrets, but he would sit in the room next door on a portable toilet drinking martinis and watching through the wall.
Yeah, he drank like heroic amounts of alcohol, like ludicrous amounts of alcohol all the time.
I mean, it was usually LSD, but an agent later said, quote, "If we were scared enough of a drug to not want to try it, we would send it to San Francisco," end quote. So they opened another safe house for White. Here they got folks and tested stink bombs, itching powder, sneezing powder, diarrhea inducers, all folks who thought they were like going to parties or to hook up with prostitutes. And then they would just come and then get like diarrhea or vomit or whatever because they're like testing this shit. Or they would dose them with LSD, and then like these prostitutes would try to get them to spill secrets on, in bed or whatever.
While they're shitting themselves and like scratching themselves uncontrollably.
Different
projects. Tell me your secrets.
But this whole time he kept his day job. So in the day he's busting people on the streets for drugs, and then at night he's like drugging randos with untested drugs.
Don't put your day job until you're sure that your side hustle is going to pay off.
If you want proof of how much of a ghoul this motherfucker is. So in 1975, after everything's coming apart for MK Ultra, White actually wrote Gottlieb and said, quote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? Pretty good stuff, brother." End quote.
Yeah. So White, like his origin story is basically in the OSS. He was an OSS officer during World War II, and he supposedly murdered a Japanese spy with his bare hands during an interrogation. After the war, he joined NYPD's anti-jazz task force. He would basically do drugs with musicians, entrap them, arrest them, and then force them to lose their, they had to have these cards to play music in like bars and venues. So if you got a drug conviction, you could no longer play in these bars anymore. So basically this was a concerted effort on the part of the NYPD to target jazz musicians specifically.
I'm going to make a guess here and think that anti-jazz initiative was part of curtailing civil rights for African Americans.
Surely it's not racially coded. It couldn't possibly be.
Yeah, definitely not.
Jazz,
they just don't like the beat rhythm. They can't handle that.
Jazz was also appealing to white people as well, and there was this integration that was happening. And again, that's not going to solve any problems. Like we know, systemic racism is not going to be fixed by white and black people coming together in a bar, but that was a fear of the NYPD because they were racist as fuck. But in 1949, White became kind of infamous because he arrested Billie Holiday for possession of opium. And although she was acquitted and accused White of planting the opium, that she'd been clean for a couple of years before this happened, this series of events and the stress that followed were contributing factors in her early death, like 10 years later.
Because she sang that song about lynching, no?
Yeah, Strange Fruit.
Strange Fruit. In 1950, White worked for Senator Joe McCarthy, seeking to expose communists in the U.S. State Department. But he was so reckless and unfocused and whatever that he was fired after less than a year. Most of White and Gottlieb's victims were a different kind of expendable from refugees and spies. They were drug users, petty criminals, sex workers, pornographers, basically people who were unlikely to report abuse or unlikely to be believed if they did report abuse. In fact, there was a woman who did go to the nearest hospital and report that she felt like she'd been drugged at this apartment. But after a few hours, the hospital staff told her she was mistaken, actually, because the CIA had made arrangements with NYPD and the medical community to ignore reports about things that happened at this apartment, basically. So the hospital staff called NYPD, and NYPD were like, nope, not a problem. In late 1952, 2 CIA pilots were shot down over China and held prisoner. China offered to let the pilots go if the U.S. would just admit that they were CIA agents. Eisenhower would not, and they were held for 20 years when Richard Nixon finally was like, yes, they were CIA agents, and now they can come home. But in the meantime, the CIA were like absolutely losing their fucking minds because they were positive that China was doing to these 2 CIA agents what the CIA was doing to Soviet spies that they had captured. They were sure that they were being tortured and drugged and turned into, the fucking Manchurian candidate or whatever. So now we're getting to the Korean War here. So in July 1953, following the nominal end to the Korean War, I know it's technically still going on. It was just an armistice. But, hostilities ceased for the most part. The DPRK released 7,200 U.S. soldiers from prison, many of whom wrote these like really scathing critiques of the United States and praised the DPRK and communism. And they admitted to committing war crimes on behalf of the U.S. 21 soldiers even chose to remain in either the DPRK or China. The Pentagon threatened to execute them for desertion if they were ever captured. Of the war crimes, several pilots admitted to dropping biological weapons on civilian populations, which again contradicts this official story that the U.S. would never and has never used biological weapons. Of course, rather than any kind of like self-reflection on the nature of the U.S., a lot of these critiques are going to sound extremely familiar to anybody who's been on social media in the last 10 to 15 years. The soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen were accused of being brought up wrong, of being gay, of having fallen in love with Asian women, of being, and I'm quoting from Newsweek here, shifty-eyed and groveling cowards who they basically had sold out the U.S. in exchange for good treatment. And a bunch of like talking heads on like news reports were saying that American masculinity was being replaced with a generation of pampered kids and mama's boys. And I must stress that this was in the 1950s. This was 1953 that they're saying this same exact shit that gets said about people today. It's the same fucking garbage.
I'm just hoping that you're going to say that they were saying that they were woke or something. That would have been awesome.
Yeah.
And they all just have to make their bed.
They got infected with the woke mind virus while they were in the DPRK.
Cultural Marxism.
Actually, the woke mind virus is LSD, and the CIA did do that.
Yeah, exactly. But another popular theory, other than, people being gay or effeminate or whatever, is that they were brainwashed, and that this was surely proof the commies had beaten the U.S. to the punch, that they had perfected mind control and they'd used it on all these soldiers and sailors. And the fact that the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines could not remember the brainwashing was just proof that it had been successful.
Obviously.
Yeah, if they had remembered it, it would have been proof. If they didn't remember it, it was proof. It's so fucking stupid. In reality, most of the men, even the ones who chose to stay in the DPRK or China, most of them did come back to the US. They explained that the reason they stayed wasn't because of torture or brainwashing. They were just pissed off about structural inequality in the US. And they were like, it's actually pretty good here. But if you grow up in one place and then you go to another, you do at some point, you're going to feel some kind of sense of homesickness. You're going to have less connection to that, culture or place or people. And so obviously you're going to want to go home and see your family and all that sort of thing. But they weren't brainwashed. They just saw reality that the United States is full of shit, So one of the CIA's major issues was getting a steady supply of LSD. It was a Swiss company, since the doctor who made it was Swiss. A Swiss company owned the patent on it. And rumors were circulating amongst the intelligence community that they were selling massive quantities of LSD to the USSR. This was another fake story. I am sure that it was started by somebody at the CIA to convince senior officials at the CIA that this was a priority. It was just a fucking bullshit whirlpool. There was no evidence that the USSR was doing it. And this is a pretty funny story, actually. In 1953, the CIA spent $240,000, which is about $2.8 million in 2024 bucks, to purchase literally the entire world supply of LSD. What's amazing, though, is that the dude who went to buy it was like, they have 10 kilograms that were buying for $2.8 million, and then came back with it. At which point the CIA discovered that this guy was a fucking dingus and did not know the difference between kilograms and grams. The Swiss company had, in its entire existence, only produced 40 grams of LSD, and they only had 10 grams left of those 40 grams, which they sold to the CIA for, again, in today's money, $2.8 million. Like, the CIA was like, hell yeah, we could just use this forever. This is going to be enough to like dose like hundreds of thousands of people. And then they got 10 grams for that. Was incredible. But this was like a big stress for Gottlieb, because he was like, this is not enough to continue my project. So when he found out that the Swiss were like tired of dealing with the CIA and all this drama, they wished. In fact, I think there was one of the officials at the organization was like, I wish this had never been invented. You know, it's just been nothing but a hassle for us. Gottlieb was like, oh, well, if they don't care, I'm just going to go to Eli Lilly, which is a U.S. pharmaceutical company, and just have them synthesize it for me instead.
Which they did.
In great quantities also. Great enough for Gottlieb to answer a burning question. How much LSD would be required to permanently break a person's psyche? And sub-question, once broken, could an alternative personality be laid over that blank slate? But a handful of quote-unquote expendables in New York were not going to be sufficient, nor suitable supply of victims to answer these questions. Enter the director of research at the Addiction Research Center, Harris Isbell. His facility in Lexington, Kentucky was nominally a hospital, but it was run more or less like a prison. Most of the inmates were Black men, former or current drug addicts, and therefore extremely unlikely to have any recourse if they were abused. Isbell was himself interested in LSD and had requested a large quantity from the CIA early in 1953. Gottlieb saw this and was like, my man, this is my dude. So in July, Gottlieb visited the prison and came to an arrangement with Isbell. The CIA would supply the prison with sufficient LSD. Isbell would design and operate the experiments, and then he would send reports on his findings back to the CIA. Isbell called his test subjects volunteers, but this is highly suspect. He would, this is where the heroin comes back in. He would, because a lot of them were heroin addicts, he would offer them heroin in exchange for participating in these experiments. So he'd be like, look, if you take this LSD and submit to these tests, I will give you heroin at the end. But the experiments were fucking horrific. One volunteer was given 180 micrograms of LSD, after which he stated that he felt like, and this is a quote here, he felt like he would die or go permanently insane, end quote, if he had any more. And he asked, please, can I not continue? According to Isbell's notes, he required, quote unquote, considerable persuasion, but he did relent and was dosed again. Isbell steadily increased dosages to all of his volunteers to 300 micrograms, reporting that, quote, the mental effects of LSD-25 were very striking. They included anxiety, a feeling of unreality, feelings of electric shocks on the skin, tingling sensations, choking, marked changes in visual perceptions, including blurred vision, abnormal coloration of familiar objects, flickering shadows, dancing dots of lights, and spinning circles of color. Frequently, inanimate objects were distorted and changed in size.
Like a normal dose of LSD is what, like 30 micrograms or 40 micrograms or something?
Yeah, it's something like that. And he was basically 10 times as much as what a normal person would do to enjoy themselves, theoretically. So Gottlieb visited Isbell frequently, and he would sit in on these experiments just to observe them. One of Isbell's volunteers turned out to be former physician and state senator William Henry Wall, who had been arrested on drug charges after becoming addicted to Demerol following dental surgery. He was convicted and sentenced to a short stint at the Addiction Research Center. Following release, Wall was like completely fucked. Like, his psyche was completely fractured. He was not the same person. He suffered delusions, paranoia, panic attacks, and suicidal ideation. In a book written about this nightmare, Wall's son says, quote, what Harris Isbell did to my father was to assault him with a poison that permanently damaged his brain. The CIA's ill-conceived, covert Cold War scheme to find a mind-controlled drug for use on hostile leaders had caught my father in its hateful web. end quote. Maybe the worst of Isbell's experiments involved placing 7 inmates in isolation, giving them double, triple, and quadruple doses of LSD over and over and over with no break, absolutely no break in the trip, basically for 77 days straight. One test subject was a 19-year-old heroin addict named Eddie Flowers, who said, quote, "It was the worst shit I ever did," end quote, but he felt coerced into volunteering because Isbell promised him heroin if he did. Carl Pfeiffer, chairman of the Department of Pharmacology at Emory University, was another of Gottlieb's co-conspirators. Pfeiffer used inmates from a federal prison in Atlanta and a juvenile detention center in New Jersey. Pfeiffer tested both a variety of central nervous system depressants and LSD on these. Again, some of these were children, these test subjects.
In 1954, at the Walter F. Bernard School in Massachusetts, they actually fed disabled children cereal laced with uranium and radioactive calcium.
Jesus. Some of you may have heard this name, but there's this notorious Boston gangster named Whitey Bulger. But in the 50s, he was just kind of a low-level street thug. In his mid-20s, he was sentenced to prison in Atlanta. He and 19 other inmates were given LSD nearly every day for 15 months straight without being told what it was. The inmates were told it was maybe a cure for schizophrenia that they were testing. He called Pfeiffer, quote, a modern-day Mengele. He said, quote, "I was in prison for committing a crime and feel they committed a worse crime on me," end quote, which is fucking valid, dude. Robert Hyde, the assistant superintendent of Boston's psychopathic hospital, was also hired by Gottlieb to perform a series of tests. One such study, run by Hyde, involved giving, quote, hundreds of students from Harvard, Emerson, and MIT a little vial of clear, colorless, and odorless liquid, end quote, in exchange for $15. They were told that it might produce an altered state. Several of the students had adverse reactions to the drug. One hung herself in the clinic bathroom. She basically went into the bathroom and hung herself immediately. None of the staff who were operating the study were properly trained on how to guide participants, nor what to look out for, nor did they have any kind of understanding of the impacts of LSD themselves. So this is, again, from the Nuremberg Code, where it says that people who conduct these experiments need to be qualified to do so. 100% not the case, at least in this study.
White's sitting on a toilet drinking martinis.
Right, yeah. Same fucking thing. Yeah, this weird ass dude fucking ruining people's lives. Harold Abramson, a New York allergist. So this is the fucking guy who would take LSD home and dose his friends without telling them. He was given $85,000 and a virtually unlimited supply of LSD along with other psychoactive substances by Gottlieb, which he used to torture children. He gave 12 pre-puberty boys psilocybin. He gave 14 children who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, all between the ages of 6 and 11, 100 micrograms of LSD every day for 6 weeks. And that's all I got to say. This was a fucking lot.
Yeah, and it doesn't end there.
No. Yeah. Justin, what have you got?
Yeah. Okay. Now that we're getting into the thick of MK Ultra, so this is when they're really kind of rolling along. Around 1954, this fucked up neurologist from Cornell, Harold Wolff, was recruited, and they gave him $140,000, which is about $1.5 million, to run CIA experiments. His patients told that the drugs they were given were essential for their treatment, so it was they didn't know what the fuck was happening.
Right.
And Wolff's purpose was, he said, quote, changes in behavior due to stress brought about by actual loss of cerebral tissue. One of the first projects he ran was that he lured 100 Chinese refugees with the promise of fellowships, so able to come to the U.S. or whatever. And the goal was to send them back to commit sabotage, the whole Manchurian Candidate thing. And they were all subjected to complete isolation, sensory deprivation, while on a constant cocktail of drugs. They used isolation, they induced anxiety, lack of sleep, chronic hunger, mood disturbances, and pain, all while doing their tests, which of course didn't create a Manchurian Candidate. And, Tony, just in case you thought that the U.S.'s liberal little brother, Canada, is innocent, Ewan Cameron of McGill University in Montreal is here to prove you wrong. Most of his patients weren't extreme cases. These were people that came in for like anxiety or family troubles or postpartum depression. And again, they were told that this was essential for their treatment. So he started by putting them into a semi-comatose state for between 10 days and 3 months. So they were like just completely disconnected from reality for sometimes months. The purpose, he said, was to produce, quote, not only a loss of space-time image, but a loss of all feeling. In more advanced forms, the patient may be unable to walk without support to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence, end quote. Then he would use electroshock on them at 30 to 40 times more than what his peers were doing at the time. And after that, he would put them in a solitary ward and feed them constant LSD while not giving them almost any food, water, or oxygen. He would put helmets on them with earphones that repeated phrases thousands of times like, "My mother hates me." In the end, he said that he figured out how to destroy minds, but not how to rewrite them. One of the notes after a session with one of his patients says, quote, and this is like a brag, he says, quote, the shock treatment turned the 19-year-old honors student into a woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed a bottle, and urinated on the floor.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So in 1955, the U.S. is starting to figure out ways to assassinate world leaders. And so they planted a bomb on Air India Flight 300, which was supposed to have Zhou Enlai on it on his way to the Asian African Congress. And it blew up and killed 16 people. But Zhou Enlai was not on the flight because he had changed flights. So the U.S. was very sad about that. And they figured that it would be better if they could poison him while he was at the Congress. So they got Gottlieb himself to deliver a poison to agents in Jakarta to poison his rice, and then it would kill him like 24 to 48 hours later, like undetected. And this was the same poison that Gottlieb gave to CIA agent James Kronthal to kill himself because he was about to be outed as gay by McCarthy.
Yeah, and this, that story was in my section, and I kind of skipped over it. There is some debate as to whether Kronthal was committed suicide by drinking the poison or whether he was murdered, like given the poison, and I don't think it was actually Gottlieb though. I think it was Dulles or somebody like that who did it.
I think he had dinner with Gottlieb the day before he killed himself.
Yeah, but
that's where anyway. But whatever, it's like I tried to skip over like the stories about whatever, like U.S. quote unquote heroes that got killed or whatever. Like
right. Yeah. I skipped over the Olsen story. Right. Like it's the guy who like he goes to, he's like, I can't handle this anymore. I hate this project. I want out basically. And then he goes to a cabin in the woods with a bunch of CIA agents, does some LSD, and then either jumps out of a hotel window or was pushed out of a hotel window. And either way, it doesn't really matter, but it's like,
well, yeah, it's because then he went to after he got dosed with LSD and didn't know that he got dosed with LSD, he went to a psychiatrist that he didn't realize was part of the project. And then he dosed him with LSD continuously for 3 months until he threw himself out a window or was pushed out of a window.
It sucks, but also CIA
it's not as fucked up as feeding children uranium.
Right.
Yeah. So they ended up, because China was like Johnny on the spot, and they immediately figured out that there was an assassination plot and very quickly figured out that the CIA was behind it. They ended up canceling the plan to poison his rice. Gottlieb was fucking pissed. Like he was so angry.
I didn't get to kill a world leader.
Yeah, I know. And there's 100 stories like the ones that we've already told, unfortunately. But by the 1960s, they were pretty sure that mind control wasn't going to happen. So they kind of shifted over to poison and murder, establishing the Health Alteration Committee. And the first assignment was to...
What a euphemism.
The first assignment was to murder Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. So again, Gottlieb, very excited to to do his duty, actually went to the Congo to deliver this poison, which is poison from a shellfish that they had condensed down to this tiny amount that like even just a drop of it would kill you. So this agent was like, what the fuck? Like, I don't want to murder somebody. Maybe he did do it, but went back on it later. Who the fuck knows? But he said that the security was too tight, and so he dumped it. But, lucky for the U.S., a month and a half later, Lumumba was killed by rebels in his own country. There's another story, 1962, a Yuri Nosenko, a Soviet intelligence officer, defected to the West. And just like earlier, the CIA suspected that he was a fake defector. So they sent him to a safe house in Maryland, where he was put in a small windowless concrete room, tortured with all the CIA MK-Ultra tricks for 1,277 days until it was determined that he was a genuine defector and released.
Jesus.
In 1968, another extension of the MK-Ultra program that evolved into the Health Alteration Committee, 3 PLA prisoners were sent to a black site where their skulls were hinged open and implanted with electrodes. And then they put them all in a room together with knives and shocked them in hopes that it would make them violent and kill each other.
Ugh.
When they didn't kill each other, then the Green Berets shot them and burned the corpses.
Holy fuck.
We scanned over like the Canada one, right? There were over 100 people that were quote unquote treated this way. Many of them came out catatonic or unable to determine reality from fiction. And these are people that went in for like fucking postpartum, you know what I mean? And then they're just drugged unsuspecting. And all of these, the CIA developed all these shell companies so that they were completely removed from the process. So a lot of these doctors didn't even realize that they were, working for the CIA. They were just real excited to be torturing people for science, I guess.
Yeah, the tennis player who died from an overdose. One of the nurses who administered the drugs was like, we didn't know what was in there. It could have been cat piss for all we know, Like they did it because the doctor told them to, and the doctor was the only one who knew what was in it.
And nobody was like prosecuted for any of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, this was the Nuremberg Code was used to prosecute and execute Nazis. But then the CIA went and did the same thing, and there were no repercussions, even though everybody now knows about MK-Ultra. The documents have been mostly declassified. They burned a bunch of them, so I'm sure most of the horrific shit we don't even get to see.
Yeah, I can't
the
even
most
imagine.
horrific shit we don't get to see. It's fucked.
To kind of speak a little bit more about the Canadian example at McGill University by Dr. Ewan Cameron, I think his last name was.
Yeah.
So currently there's a court case that's ongoing against McGill University for allowing these MK-Ultra experiments to proceed. So there's currently 300 families who are suing McGill for this. And there was a ruling just last year, so October 2023, in regards to it. And they ruled that the U.S. government and the CIA, of course, have immunity in the court case and are not going to be impacted by any of its findings or rulings that come out of the matter. So
beautiful. Yeah, I mean, one of the people who got dosed at one of the universities in one of these tests was fucking Ted Kaczynski. Like, I wonder.
The irony of all of it is that the CIA spent all these years like torturing people, didn't get anything out of it, except that the pathway to pop culture happens because one of the doctors in New York, I believe it was, that was part of the MK-Ultra program, brought some LSD, and he would do it with like his homies on the weekend, one of whom was like a diplomat or ambassador or something. And then she ended up getting LSD from him and doing it with Dean Martin, who then gave an interview where he said that it's called like the reality behind the new Dean Martin or some shit. And he gave this interview where he talked about doing LSD. That popularizes LSD in the mind of the American public, popularized by the author, I can't even remember his name right now, but One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he actually worked at one of the labs where LSD was, and he stole some did it and then like came up with this idea for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so that was like the other thing. So the CIA creates this counterculture that actually opposes everything that the CIA was about in the 60s, like the whole.
I sort of have I feel of a lot of ways about this. And I also listened to an interview with the author of the book that was one of the sources for this episode. And he said much of the same, that it sort of like inadvertently created this counterculture. But, you know, another thread of this also goes with like Tim Leary and the teacher then, Alpert is his surname, but is known as Ram Dass in like the spiritual community. And like, I also wonder if, I'm not suggesting that this was like predetermined or what their sort of goal was to begin with, but there's a large vein within this counterculture that isn't just anti-war or anti-establishment. It's also about a sort of like neoliberal spirituality and what we sort of see later, and encouraging people to sort of like tap out, tune out, focus on themselves, just do love. And I feel a lot of different ways. I think it's like a cheeky sort of like way to wrap up the story to suggest, oh, here, you know, they've created their own enemy as imperialists always do. But there's an element within this that sort of serves the same end.
It's neutered,
you know?
Yeah, whatever, controlled opposition or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
It is complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm not trying to imply that like it ended up being the CIA's demise. Obviously, it wasn't. But just, I guess, if we can take any like kind of from this like nightmare story, it is that, you know, that they ended up creating all these hippies that were anti-war.
Yeah, but it's just like, it's such a, like, and I'm not saying like it would have been better if they had developed mind control. But Christ, like what a waste, like an absolute waste of human life for nothing. And over nothing.
And it's like the most desperate human life, right? These are people that are hurting.
Yeah. People who are vulnerable, people who are precarious, people who have nowhere to go, nobody to turn to. The CIA fucking are like, yes, we can use that.
And it's sort of, though, more nefarious than that. It's not even that it was for nothing, because actually what they gleaned, right, from this data becomes ways that they continue to manipulate marginalized people around the world, right? We see this in every conflict region since then, continuing to this day, right? Incentivizing marginalized people. They like learned that, yes, we can take advantage of people who are starving, people who are vulnerable, people who are in search of some alternative to the sort of day-to-day help that they live in. And we see this like now.
Yeah.
So that about does it for this episode. Thanks so much, Justin and Jeremy, for leading us through this interesting history. And to all of our listeners and, of course, our Patreon subscribers. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/ProlesPod for free. If you have any questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at ProlesPod@outlook.com. Remember, you can follow us, review, like, and do all that fun algorithm stuff. And we'll see you again in about 2 weeks. May the Spectre haunt your streets, and solidarity
forever.
DTA.
They envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style.
Stalin.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro. Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Bring back